It's a real pleasure and honor to have this week's guest. She's one of the Fox News Channel's most recognized faces, a best-selling author, co-anchor of Fox News election coverage, and the award-winning anchor and executive editor of Fox's The Story with Martha MacCallum. Martha MacCallum, thanks for joining us today on Next Steps Forward.
Hi, Chris. Great to be here.
Great to have you. We were joking a little bit before the show about how I'm a little nervous. I'm on the other side of the interview today, so help us get through.
You're doing fantastic.
Still early, but thank you. So Martha's reported 5 presidential elections and many of the biggest national and international news stories of our time. She covered the post 9/11 war on terror, the funerals of President George H.W. Bush and Pope John Paul II. She's interviewed some of the foremost thought leaders and influential politicians of the past 2 decades. And just this year, Martha released her first book, Unknown Valor, A Story of Family, Courage, and Sacrifice from Pearl Harbor to Iwo Jima, which was well received and just one of the topics we're going to discuss today. So lots of things to talk about here, Martha. I know more than a few folks in journalism, and I'm always fascinated by how many of them really had an interest in the news in an early age. And that certainly applies to you. I understand that you watched the Watergate hearings when you were just 9 years old. What was it about that chapter in our history that was so interesting to you at a very young age?
I was young. I thought maybe I was 8 years old. I remember my older sister, was always very interested in news, and she was a teenager at that point. And she kept impressing upon me that there was this huge historic event that was going on, the hearings that were taking place. And so we would sit next to each other on the floor in front of the TV, and she would explain to me about John Dean and John Haldeman and Ehrlichman and all of the players and George Mitchell. And we would go through what was happening. And from that moment on, I really have always been more interested in fact and history than in fiction. Pretty much everything I read is, for the most part, nonfiction. I just thought the drama of the characters that were involved in that saga. And I remember the day that Richard Nixon and Pat Nixon, the First Lady, got on Marine One, and he turned around and flashed those V's before leaving, and sort of hovering over the White House and taking off after resigning the presidency of the United States, which is just an earthquake, for the nation. And it just really resonated with me. Even as a little kid, I thought, this is dramatic. This is amazing to be a witness to history. And I didn't decide then, obviously, what I wanted to do as a career, but that excitement of the drama that surrounded that moment really stuck with me.
So you end up as an anchor now, but those early aspirations weren't quite taking you down the path of being a famous news anchor. You were thinking about being an actress and a director rather than being a journalist.
That's right.
And you even studied at New York's Circle in the Square Theater School for 2 years after graduating from college.
I did.
What drew you to theater? What was the interest there?
I always loved theater. I think that there's a performance element to all of these things, and there's a drama element to all of these things. And so I see now how they all come together. But at that time, I did major in political science in college, and government. So I was always very interested in politics. But I also loved theater. So I minored in theater. And after college, I definitely had that feeling that, you only get these opportunities once in life, to be young and to not really have anything tying me down. I wasn't married, any of that at that point. And I decided to, without telling my parents, audition for this program in New York as a graduate school. And at the time I was also kind of going the law school route. I had taken my LSATs. The scores were not really, I was not going to Harvard Law. So I thought, all right, well, let's see, let's pursue this theater thing for a while, which I did. So I got accepted to this Circle in the Square program, which was an amazing experience. It's a 2-year, very intensive theater experience that includes directing and dance and voice and all of it. And it was an extraordinary life lesson for me. There's a ton of discipline to it. And it's an emotional experience. It's, digging deep for those, to connect with characters. And I loved it. I still love the theater. I'm so bereft right now that all of these theaters that surround my office are all shuttered. And I just have always loved the excitement of the stage. So I think it all does come together in its own way, the work that I do now. But I'm so grateful that my parents sort of, gave me the free rein to do what I wanted to do in those years in my early 20s, because it's an experience that I'll always treasure.
A lot of actors and actresses pay the rent by waiting tables, as did you.
Oh, yeah.
But it was another waitress, one who was working in the news, that sparked
Right.
your interest in journalism.
That's right.
What did Julia Jordan, who was also working at CNN at the time, say to cause you to make such a dramatic change in your career paths?
So it was interesting. She and I were good buddies. We were waiting tables together. There's always a lot of camaraderie in a restaurant. I don't know if you've ever worked in one, but, between the kitchen and the waiters and the waitresses and the managers, and we were on the Upper West Side of New York. So I was actually working at a financial magazine at the time, also doing fact checking, researching things for other people's stories, which I love doing. And then I would go over to the restaurant and wait tables at night to, put it all together to pay the rent. So she got an internship, I think it was in the beginning at CNN. And so we would all gather early in the evening at 4:00 for our free dinner of pasta before we started our shift. So you didn't want to miss the free dinner. And she was just talking about what she was doing at CNN and sitting in the story meetings and listening to the producers, and just something clicked in me that, that this was something that would kind of bring together all of my interests in storytelling and news and government and politics, which I had always loved. So it was really it was definitely one of those moments when you sort of think, that's where I should be. That's what I should be doing. And I shortly after that, I got a job, working at this magazine, doing financial news and learning the ropes there. And it's funny because many years later, I ran into Julia Jordan at an art opening downtown in New York it was art students. And I said, guess what I'm doing? And I told her, and she said, guess what I'm doing? She said, I'm a playwright. So we really sort of swapped.
Yeah.
And she's been successful as well. So kind of a cool story.
Very cool. Thank you for sharing that. And obviously that was a major life-changing decision. What advice do you have for people out there listening to us that they're recognizing and acting upon? There's a fork in the road. What do they do to succeed in that career?
Yeah. I'm not a big planner. I'm not a big, this is where I want to be in 3 years and 5 years. I'm a pretty firm believer in following your gut and listening to sort of what your path is meant to be. And I believe there's a spiritual side to that as well. So I think that you do have to, give things serious thought and consideration. But when something's tugging at you, you do need to listen to it. And we only get one time to go around in this life. And so when something is saying to you, this is an idea that you keep returning to, I believe you need to listen to it. So I think instinct and gut and head and heart combined are really what it's always been about for me. I always knew that I didn't want to work in an office job, and that I wanted my career to be something that had meaning to me. And I didn't really care that much about whether or not I was going to make any money doing it. I've been fortunate to have become successful in that as well. But I really think that because I was always driven by a passion and enthusiasm, the rest of it ended up coming together, which is very, very lucky for me. But I just, the 3-year plan, the 5-year plan. I remember people asking me that at interviews when I was finishing college. I interviewed for like an insurance job and something else, and they always went, and I thought, oh God, I don't know. Who knows what I want to be in 5 years? I have no idea.
Tomorrow, let alone 5 years.
Exactly.
Well, that's certainly been obviously a recipe for success, and thanks for sharing that with our listeners. So now you're several years out of college and you've decided to leave the theater and pursue a career in journalism. Take us through your start. How did you get your first break? And then ultimately, how did you land at Fox News?
So they sort of overlapped each other. While I was waiting tables, I was also doing this fact checking and research job because I needed 2 jobs to pay my rent. So the woman, Maggie Elliott, who I worked for at Corporate Finance Magazine, which was just a small trade magazine, she said to me, would you like to try writing? Would you like to try your hand at doing some very small pieces for the magazine? So I started doing that. And then she offered me a job, a full-time job. And that was sort of when I had to make a decision to leave one life behind and throw my lot in with the other. And it felt pretty natural. It felt like the absolute right thing to do at that time. So I started working with that magazine, and then I made my way to the Wall Street Journal, where I worked at the Wall Street Journal Report. I wanted to get a job on the newspaper, but they didn't have anything for me at the time in the jobs that I had applied for. So there was a job opening in the public relations department. So I just thought, well, maybe that's just a way to get in the door. So I did that. Didn't really like that. It wasn't my thing, but it was perfect because I was there for 6 months, and then I sort of weaseled my way into the Wall Street Journal television network, which was doing a weekend business news program, and basically, kept bugging them and saying, I'll do anything. I'll be, your production assistant. I will sweep the floor. I'll do whatever you want. And so eventually Chris Graves hired me there. Great boss. And then again, really, I kept pushing these story ideas. I wanted to be a reporter. I wanted to get out in the field and do my own stories. And after I finally wore him down, and he let me go out with a camera and shoot a few stories. And he then eventually said to me, we have this Tokyo business affiliation, and they want someone to do an on-camera, business minute for Tokyo. So 3 of us went in there to do sort of a read through in front of the camera. I'd never been in front of the camera in news before. So I remember I was smiling and my jaw was kind of frozen, and my cheeks were literally shaking because I couldn't talk. I was so nervous. And for some reason they picked me. So that was the beginning. And then the more I did it, the more relaxed I became. And then I started to love, sort of the high wire act of, of the whole thing. So, and then I went from there to CNBC, where I worked on the floor of the New York Stock Exchange. And they put me down there on day one. They hired me as a reporter, put me down, said, go to the stock exchange, here's the key to the little door of our booth where we work. And, this is pre 9/11, of course. So I just walked in the door of the stock exchange, went up this back, staircase, and there weren't really anybody there. It was way before trading hours. And I turned on the computer, and they said, well, you're going to need to talk to some people to do a morning report where you're going to be on at 9:20 with a pre-market report. So give us 2 minutes of something. So I remember going down to the floor of the New York Stock Exchange, and really I was I had been a financial reporter for a couple of years, but doing long form stories, not market coverage. So I just sort of tapped a couple of guys on the shoulder and said, what do you expect to happen today? And why would that happen? And what stocks do you think will be moving? And I had my notepad. I just kept scribbling down everything they said, basically. And then there was a little camera that was perched on the balcony above the floor. And, the producer, I put my earpiece in, and they said, you see that little camera up there on, hanging on the side of the thing? I said, yes, I do. All right, you're going to talk into that. All right, we're coming to you in 30 seconds. I was okay. So I did this, I spieled off this 2-minute report on what the traders had told me they expected to happen that day. And afterwards I thought, okay, that's it. They're just going to probably call me and say okay, thanks a lot. We don't need you anymore. But so I called back to the office, and they said, that was good. Can you do another one at 9:40? Okay. So that was pretty much the way that went. And it was a great experience working down there. Maria Bartiromo was down there at the time, and Nicole Petalides, and, people who became lifelong friends. So and I met a lot of people working on the floor of the stock exchange who I became good buddies with as well. And it was a great education for me. It was a terrific experience. And it was like reporting in the field, essentially, because, it had that feeling to it. Back then, there was so much activity on the floor of the stock exchange.
Exactly.
People were actually doing huge trades, and there was buzz and excitement, and all the specialists would run to, one tower or the other, and you knew something was happening. So you'd get over there and try to find out what the story was. It was like covering a fire, it was very, very interesting. So I loved that. That was great.
So you start on the floor as a reporter for CNBC. You then move upstairs to the anchor desk up there.
Yeah.
And then ultimately transition over to Fox. What led to that move for you?
So, business news was sort of my way into doing news. When I got the job at the financial magazine, it was not my love of finance. It was my love of writing and journalism. So I had to learn business and learn finance in the job. But I always wanted to eventually make my way back to politics. And so that door opened for me like in 2003, I would say. I was at CNBC during 9/11. And, that was an extraordinary experience because obviously it had such a dramatic impact on everyone on Wall Street, as you know, very, very well. And then I wasn't really looking to go anywhere, and Fox reached out to me and said, Roger Ailes would like to meet with you and your agent and your husband. We're going to have dinner. So that's what we did. And we had a really good talk. Neil Cavuto was there as well. And at that time, they were thinking about starting a business channel. So, we were just sort of talking in very broad terms, nothing specific. I was looking towards the future, a year or so down the road. And then eventually, I just relayed the message that if I were to make a move, I wanted to be in politics. I wanted to cover politics. I didn't want to cover business anymore. I wanted to get over to my main love. And eventually I got that spot to do that at Fox. So that was really exciting. And when I got here, it was the New Hampshire primaries in 2004. And so an election was underway. So I couldn't have been more excited. And by that summer, I convinced them to give me some part in the convention. I literally said, I'll stand on the street corner outside and talk about, how many people are going in and out. And they said, no, we're going to put you on the floor. You and Major Garrett and Carl Cameron are going to be our 3 floor reporters. And you're going to just, tell us the stories that are going on around you and what's happening on the convention floor. So honestly, to this day, that election and being on the floor for that election was one of the most exciting times of my career. It was like, I was just sort of peppering these reports with what was going on around me and the people that were there. The first President Bush was there and all of these people sitting right near me and just grabbing people for interviews. So that was really an exhilarating time.
Right place, right time. That's fascinating. So I'd like to, if we could, just go back to theater for a moment.
Yeah.
Some people draw comparisons between the parts of acting and the news business that people can see. But when I think of these two professions, I think of what happens behind the scenes, the intense preparation that goes into both jobs, the need to be able to digest and present information, obviously to improvise in a moment's notice. You talked about the high wire act earlier, the years of hard work to become an overnight success. Do you see those parallels or other ones between theater and the news profession?
Well, I think that in both, you want to reach out to people and to connect with them and to tell stories to them. That's why I named my show The Story, because for me, it's always been about all of us in the newsroom saying, did you see this story? Did you hear that story? Oh, this is such a great story. We have to do that. So those stories are what drive me. And that was true for me in theater, and it's true for me in news. The human experience is at the root of all of these things. And when we do a good job telling a story, covering an election, it's because we're tapping into what the human experience of being in America is right now, what's on people's minds, what they care about, what they're going to be thinking about when they vote. So for me, it's the human experience that connects both of those things. The preparation is intense on both fronts. I think in theater, it's a little bit more, the theater's more stable in a strange way because the play is the play. And things change in the dynamic of performing it over time, but the news changes literally all the time. So we break form constantly. We'll have a meeting midday today and we'll map out what we're going to do, but that could all change by 3 or 4 o'clock. So that you have to be very flexible and able to kind of move quickly from one thing to the next and go with it. And I think that cable news viewers in particular are very aware of that. And so they are very forgiving of us when we sort of say, oh, well, this is just coming in. We're just getting our arms around this situation. Here are the two things we know. And we're going to find out more for you. So I love it when our best plans sort of, go up in smoke and we turn gears and move our attention to something else. That is really sort of the most exciting part of the job.
We all know how journalism has changed since you were 8 or 9 years old watching the Watergate hearings. We've gone from 2 or 3 newscasts a night to the 24/7 news cycle. How has that change reshaped the news business and, as importantly, public opinion?
Well, there's no doubt that news has become more siloed. There's MSNBC and there's Fox and there's CNN, and each one of those have people on them with very strong opinions. And I think that people gravitate to those channels, obviously, based on their own feelings. I work in the news division here with Brett Baer and Shannon Bream and Bill Hemmer, and we try to be very down the middle. We try to put both sides of every opinion and equation on our programs every day. And so that's something that we take very seriously. That being said, we know that there are a lot of viewers who watch Fox who are conservative. There's 30% of them who say they're registered independent. So, there are persuadable people here, and there are people, there are people who have very wide opinions. I always say, that there's not one, if anyone meets or talks to us, they know that there's a lot of variety and range in the way that we do things and approach things and the way that we think. So, but within those sort of, preconceived notions of what's happening at each place, it's different now. It's not, sort of the plain vanilla, straightforward news programming that we all grew up with. So for me, I think each one of us has to deal with our hour and what we do on our terms. And for me, that means, being fair and being straightforward. My favorite compliment is when someone comes up to me and says, I like to watch you because I know you're going to give it to me straight. And I think you're fair. And I feel like I know you. So that's who I am, and that's what I do. It's different for every hour on all the channels. So, but it's definitely a much more wild and woolly world than it used to be in news. And there's a lot of blurred lines. So I actually think that at Fox, that our news programming is some of the most balanced programming you're going to find anywhere.
Well, I think to your point there, you truly are fair and balanced. And I do watch you every night after dinner, washing the dishes. And so thanks for your delivery on that.
Thanks, Chris.
As you look at public opinion today, how do you see the November 3rd election shaping up, and where will you be on election night?
So we will be here on election night, but between now and then in New York, we always do our live coverage from here because we have the biggest studio space here for coverage. But between now and then, we will be at all of the debates. So we're starting with Cleveland and working our way Salt Lake for the VP, and then we've got Florida, and we've got Belmont, Tennessee. So we'll be all over the country, which I love, because that's when you really get the feel for what people are talking about and what they care about. I think in New York, we get very New York centered, and we don't realize that people are looking at things very differently all across the country. So that's a great part of sort of soaking up what's going on with people. We're also doing a lot of voter panels. So we bring voters in from different areas in the battleground states in particular and ask them why they're undecided, what they're thinking, what the most important issues are to them. So we're going to be sort of soaking all that up over the course of the next couple of months. And, I don't think anybody knows where this is going. And I certainly would not venture to guess at this point. It's going to be a tight race, as we have seen is typical in American elections. And I would say any one of, 2 to 14 major events could happen between now and then in the next 2 months.
Yeah, 2 months is forever in politics, and certainly presidential politics. So very good point. We were speaking earlier of your time waiting tables. I understand that one of your college summer jobs was waiting tables at Thompsons Clan Bar on Cape
Mhm.
Cod.
That's true.
How in the world did you end up waiting tables at a place called Thompson's Clan Bar?
Well, Thompson's Clan Bar was a legendary place, and it does not exist anymore, sadly, but it was right on the water in Harwichport, and it was a great place to work. We all wore these like red, like sailor dress things because we were on the water, and it was enormous. So you had a number, like a team number, and then your number, because they would call the waiters and waitresses to come through to pick up your food based on your number. But it was an amazing place. My parents took me there when I was a kid. My grandfather loved going there. My family's always vacationed in Cape Cod. So it was a natural place for me to want to spend the summer and make money. And one of the people who used to hang out there all the time and come in for chowder was Tip O'Neill. And we were told, everyone had to park, all the guests had to park in this parking lot across the street. And there was like a little, there was a valet service and everything, but there was this one car, this big old car. I think it was like an old Cadillac or maybe an Oldsmobile, would just kind of pull up and park right next to the front door. And then he'd go inside, and that was Tip. Tip could park wherever he wanted.
Exactly. That's great.
So, he would come in for chowder a lot. So it's a great New England spot. So I have great memories of working at Thompson's Clan Bar. I wish it was still there.
Well, you and I have swapped stories in restaurants for places we like to go to on the Cape. But obviously most of our listeners have never been to Cape Cod, and they may only know it through the movie Jaws, which obviously has scared millions of people out of the ocean for decades now. But apparently you're fascinated by great white sharks. What's the deal with you and sharks?
Well, in Chatham, where we like to go, has one of the largest great white shark populations in the world. So that's why I'm fascinated by them, because I'm surrounded by them. And, for people in our neck of the woods up there, Jaws is not just a movie, it's real. And one of these days I'm going to go on the shark expedition that takes you out, and then they have a spotter plane that goes up in the sky, and they spot the sharks, and you can see them up close. But, they're scary. And I was so fascinated by Jaws as a kid. And the movie theater in Chatham, they play Jaws at like 9:30 at night a lot in the summer. And seeing it on the big screen again, which I did not too long ago, I highly recommend, because it's sort of a staple in my house. I mean, my husband, I think he's probably seen it like 50 times. He could quote every line in it. So it's just something I've always been fascinated with. But I really hope that I never have, an encounter that's too close, because we have had some very tragic things happen over the past 2 years, one up in Maine and one right on the Cape in Truro. So it's like anything in life that you have to be respectful of the ocean and of these creatures. And so I love to swim in the ocean, but I stay very close to shore.
You're with Martha MacCallum. I'm Chris Meek. This is Next Steps Forward. We'll be right back after the break. We're with Fox News anchor Martha MacCallum today. Martha, I know at the start of the program that you've covered a lot of major stories. One of your biggest interviews was with Supreme Court nominee Brett Kavanaugh and his wife in the midst of his very contentious Senate confirmation hearing. Obviously, all kinds of accusations there. You were granted the only interview with the Kavanaughs during that moment in history. Obviously, that was a very tense time for them, a tense time for the country. It certainly had to be quite a challenge for you. And as I understand it, you only found out that you're doing the interview on your way to work that day. How do you prepare yourself for an exclusive story like that?
Yeah, that was a remarkable day. And the thing was that we were so immersed in that story anyway. So it wasn't like I was starting at square one. There were already a lot of things that I knew I would want to ask him if I had the opportunity. But I don't think at that moment, too many of us thought he was actually going to sit down for an interview, because he was about to go in for the next hearing. It wasn't going well, obviously, for him at that point. And there were all of these accusations. So I got a call on my way to work in the morning saying, we've got this interview. He wants to sit down with you at 2:30 in Washington with his wife. So I was in a car service, and we literally just turned around and started driving towards Washington. And I pulled out my notepad and started writing as many of the questions as I could think of that I wanted to ask, and just going back over things he'd said before, and, matching up what I wanted to sort of press him on in terms of the experiences that we had all heard so much about. And it was, I just remember getting to the hotel where the room had been reserved. It was hard for them to find a spot to do it. Obviously, every camera was following him all over Washington. So we had to do it in a way that wasn't going to draw too much attention. And, then I just sat down in front of him and his wife, who were just in this excruciating moment in their lives. They're little kids that they're trying to explain some of this to. And, you could just see the pain in their faces and the trepidation. So it was challenging because I had things that I needed to ask him, which were graphic and difficult, but I had to ask him those questions. And I tried to create an environment where it wasn't about me. It was just about what needed to be asked. And I also knew that they would not have sat down unless they wanted to address these things head on. And it was, it was definitely, there was not a lot of chatting, we literally walked in there and we sat down. I said, hi, introduced myself. They were not in a chatty mood. I think they were very nervous. And afterwards it was that they were relieved it was over, and then it was done. But I do think that really one of the biggest impacts of that is that, the first time he had been in the hearing, he was really super buttoned up. Then he did the interview in between where he sort of started to open up a little bit. Then when he went into the next hearing, he was like a rocket, like everything was coming out. He was yelling at people. It was like this whole different Brett Kavanaugh than we had seen in the earlier stages. So I think that it was kind of a progression. And, it was just interesting for me as a journalist to sort of watch him go through those stages. But it was definitely an interview that I'll always remember, because you just look at people who are in this moment in their life. And now I look at him and I think, wow, he got through that whole process. He's a Supreme Court justice, and I'm not surprised that he doesn't do too many interviews anymore. I think he wants to stick to business for probably several years, would be my guess, before he starts speaking out too much.
Of all the stories you've covered, what was your favorite one? Or that may be too difficult to answer, question to answer, but if there isn't one particular one, what makes for a good story as far as you're concerned?
Well, I would say the most impactful story for me was September 11th. And it changed our lives so much. So, and during that period, in the days that followed, I did some interviews with people. Jimmy Dunn comes to mind at Sandler O'Neill, who lost his best friend, and so many of the people that he worked with, all because he, just his partner just said to him, go play golf tomorrow morning. It's okay. And I watched him rebuild his company with the help of people who literally came in off the street and left other jobs to rebuild his business. So those stories are, they're really close to me. And I think that's the most, it's certainly for all of us who live in this area, it's just a day that we'll never forget. And of course, we just had the 19th anniversary, which is amazing to see that it was that long ago now. But that's definitely the story that impacted me the most, my thinking the most. I wouldn't call it a favorite story, obviously, but it was the most important story that I covered. And then, there have been the fun things too, like the royal wedding and the, birth of Prince George, and sort of, hanging around in London for days, watching these things unfold and seeing all of that up close, which is just a spectacle, a beautiful, beautiful spectacle to have a great memory of having been part of and witnessed up close. So those are, really special times and stories that I loved covering.
Now you talk about 9/11, and obviously over the last several days, Americans have been marking and remembering that 19th anniversary. And like you, I can't believe it's been 19 years, and how it really changed our nation. Last week when we were talking about the show, you and I talked about how the country really came together in the wake of 9/11. You've observed how two crucial qualities, how do you feel that that really helped change the world coming forward in terms of 19 years ago, we came together, and now, we talked earlier about the presidential election and how divisive things are right now.
It's just so different. I think if any of us could capture the feeling after 9/11 in a bottle and keep it forever, we would. The extraordinary outpouring. I will never forget the fire trucks that came from all across the country, coming over the bridges to help, to dig, to support. The flags that went up on every single house in every neighborhood where I live in New Jersey. And the arms that were wrapped around these families. In my town in Ridgewood, we lost 11 parents. So my kids were growing up with these, children who had lost their father, and in a couple of cases, their mother. It was just an amazing time of pulling together as a country. I think you can really only compare it to maybe World War II in terms of unity and patriotism. So I, like so many Americans, I am distraught by what I see in the country right now and how divided it is. And, a friend sent me this Nike ad that was played for all of the kids and all the athletes in her school about unity and about coming together and about Black Lives Matter. And, there was a little bit of controversy among the community of the school about the kids watching all this video, which is, is mostly just about unity and pulling together. But I said, after I watched it, she said, "Tell me what you think of this video." I said, "The thing that bothers me the most about that video, most of it is, is great, but there's not one mention in the whole video of the United States or of America. Those things are not said, and there's no flag in the whole thing. And yet the theme of it is all about unity and pulling together." But the fact that the flag would be sort of a red flag that might catch people's attention and be divisive breaks my heart. So that's where we are right now. I know that that's not where we will stay. I do believe that we will come together. I hope it's not because of a great crisis, but this pandemic has been so divisive politically that it's shocking. You might have thought that it would bring the country together, but sadly it has not. So, I think that the great thing that pulls together the heroes of 9/11 and the heroes of World War II is humility, serving something bigger than themselves, and sacrifice, the willingness to sacrifice for other people. And that is something that I hope we can regain as a nation.
You've had a lot of successes throughout your career. Let's talk about your most recent one. You've been described as a voracious reader, and I'm especially curious about how that interest or habit contributes to your success. We're going to talk about your book in a minute, but how do you choose the topics and specific books that you read?
So when I say I'm a voracious reader, it's mostly news, stories all day, things that I read 3 minutes of or 2 minutes of. So that kind of reading experience is sort of across the board. And I try to take in as much information and editorials and opinion pieces and news stories all day long as I can. So that's kind of a barrage kind of reading. But I love to read history books. I read The Splendid and the Vile recently. I read a book called Clementine about Churchill's wife, which I thought was fascinating. So that's what I like to read when I can just read for pleasure. Are books like that where I learn something more that I didn't know. I feel like there's a lot of missing history in school these days, and I think I suffered from it. So I try to fill in the gaps wherever I can.
Well, clearly your interest in historical biographies played a part in your decision to write Unknown Valor, a story of family, courage, and sacrifice from Pearl Harbor to Iwo Jima. You said that was a very moving experience. You called it a labor of love and the most satisfying professional experience of your life. And we talked about journalists having great stories. It sounds like there's more than one great story that came from that project.
So growing up, my mother shared with us the letters that her cousin Harry, who was her first cousin, very close to him. She was an only child, so he was like her big brother. And he was killed at Iwo Jima at the age of 18. And he had written these beautiful letters home. So I was always moved by them. And I would pull them out over the years, and I would share them with people I knew, read this letter. It's such an extraordinary story. It's just a kid, in the middle of 7,000 miles away from home, with a bunch of other kids who were 18 years old and who had, 6 weeks prior to that, they'd been at their senior prom. So it's a slice of life in war story about 6 different young men and their experiences growing up, and finding themselves in the middle of the Pacific in a place that was just completely alien to them, having grown up in Arlington, Massachusetts, as was Harry Gray's hometown, and Gulfport, Mississippi, and Lockport, New York, and all over the country. So I just wove their stories together until they get to the point where they meet up on Iwo Jima, and some of them survive and some of them don't. So through the writing and the research, I was really astonished to find that I found, with the help of a young researcher named Dean Lawback, who helps other people find their people that, in their families who were in World War II through his Marine Corps group. So I found 2 men who were alongside Harry Gray when he was killed, and I got to know both of them. So through that, I was able to introduce them to my aunt, who's Harry's sister, and we had a couple of amazing reunions. So it was just an amazing experience for me. I feel like I got way more out of it than anyone else did. And I'm glad that people, really seem to have loved the book, and the book has done really well. And it's just those people sort of come to life through the telling of their stories. And I've cut piles of letters and personal stories that people have sent me, telling me about their relatives in World War II. And it's amazing. When I did the book tour, people would come up to me and say, my 3 uncles and my grandfather all fought in World War II. Or my, just the depth in some of these families of military service is just so impressive to me. So it was a hard thing to do, writing the book. It was way harder than I didn't know what I was getting myself into. And I kept, oh no, we have to go all the way back to Pearl Harbor to start the book, and it just became this all encompassing beast, which I already had a full-time job, and that was enough anyway. But I'm so grateful that I did it, because it really was one of the most rewarding professional experiences of my whole life.
Any other books on the horizon?
I have a couple of ideas. I'm not doing anything till after the election's over, but I have a couple of ideas for projects that I'm thinking about doing after November 3rd, and hopefully the election ends on November 3rd.
Exactly.
Or that deadline will get pushed later.
Well, Martha, thanks for your time. We've reached the end of a fascinating conversation with Fox News' Martha MacCallum. Truly appreciate you being here, so thank you very much.
Yeah, you're pretty good at interviewing, Chris. You got to.
I learned from the best.
You're roped into this, I think. Great to talk to you.
Likewise. Thanks for your time, Martha. Have a good day.
You bet. Pleasure.
Thank you.